What would it mean if a story survived only as a shadow, if the clay remained, but the sentence that mattered most had been pressed away, smoothed over, or never written at all? In the long corridors of Mesopotamian time, loss is ordinary. Tablets crack, libraries burn, archives travel and do not return. And yet, some absences feel different, as if the record does not merely fade, but hesitates, falling quiet at the edge of something it cannot name. The modern phrase Anunnaki arrives burdened with expectations that the ancient scribes did not share. In the earliest Sumerian and Akkadian sources, the word points toward a category of divine beings, names spoken in hymns and laments, invoked in ritual, seated in the imagination of cities whose walls have turned to dust. Later texts use the term in different ways, sometimes as underworld judges, sometimes as a broader divine assembly. The sources do not offer single, tidy definition. They rarely do. And yet, across the centuries of cuneiform writing, there are patterns, recurring images that behave like warnings, a sky that becomes hostile, a gate that must be sealed, a name that is avoided. The language of omen and ritual is careful, even when the mythic narrative is grand. Some passages feel like they are circling an event that cannot be fully spoken, approaching it by analogy. A devouring storm, a choking fog, a lion-faced terror in a cedar forest, a sea that rises as if it has memory. One can begin, as many investigations begin, with a library that died and left its bones behind. In the middle of the 19th century, excavators working at Kuyunjik, part of ancient Nineveh, brought up rooms packed with broken clay. The site belonged to the Assyrian kings, and among them to Ashurbanipal, who is known to have collected texts on a vast scale. What emerged from those rooms was not a single book, but a shattered continent of writing. Myths, hymns, rituals, lexical lists, royal inscriptions, and omen series. Many pieces were small enough to vanish in a palm. Many were damaged where a few missing lines could change everything. Scholars learned to read these fragments slowly, matching signs, joining edges, rebuilding compositions from dozens, sometimes hundreds of pieces. Even now, museums hold shelves of unjoined fragments, their surfaces inscribed with sentences that begin cleanly and then break off into silence. The silence is not decorative. It is the most common feature of the archive. Within this world of reconstructed text, certain works became familiar landmarks. The flood story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the older Atrahasis tradition, the creation epic often called Enuma Elish, the vast omen compendia like Enuma Anu Enlil, where the sky is treated as a ledger of threats and promises. None of these texts speaks plainly about a cosmic predator. That phrase belongs to modern ears, an attempt to compress fear into a single image. But the ancient corpus does contain an unusual intimacy with predation as a concept. It is everywhere in the metaphors. Gods who devour, demons who eat the breath, calamities that consume a land. Plague described as a mouth moving through a city. In mythic language, devouring does not always mean teeth and hunger. It can mean erasure. It can mean disappearance. It can mean that the boundary between the living and the dead has been breached, and the breach has a soundless appetite. Some modern readers, noticing the density of these images, suggest that the myths preserve the aftertaste of something older than metaphor, a memory of catastrophic encounter written as theology. Others dispute this and point to the ordinary mechanics of literature, ritual, and politics. Fear is useful. Monsters enforce order. Cosmic battle makes a city's patron deity feel inevitable. The caution is reasonable. Mesopotamian texts were composed by humans within human systems, often for human institutions. They are not laboratory reports. They are not transcripts from the sky. Still, the archive contains oddities, moments where myth, omen, and ritual touch in ways that feel less like storytelling and more like containment. In the Omen series, the heavens are not a distant backdrop. They are a surface that can change abruptly. A lunar eclipse is not merely an eclipse. It is a message that must be interpreted with precision because the message can be lethal. a strange halo, a star with an unfamiliar color, a pattern of lightning, a month of unseasonal darkness. These are recorded as signs, categorized, compared to earlier precedents. The texts do not always agree. Some manuscripts diverge. Some lines are damaged. The record grows quiet exactly where it would be most comforting for it to speak. Ritual texts sometimes read like responses to invisible pressure. There are ceremonies for averting evil portents, for diverting harm away from a king, for sending misfortune into substitute figures, clay, wax, scapegoat animals, temporary substitute kings. Scholars debate the origin and meaning of these practices, and rightly so. They likely served political stability as much as spiritual safety. But the underlying logic is persistent. Something comes from outside the ordinary order. It announces itself through anomalies. It can be delayed, deflected, or tricked. It does not always negotiate. If a predator exists in this material, it is not a single named being that can be pointed to without strain. It is a behavior. It is a pressure in the system. It is the sense that the cosmos contains agents that do not care about human categories, and that even gods, in the stories, sometimes react as though they are managing a risk. This is where the title's contradiction begins to form. The title imagines a Sumerian tablet as a kind of confession, a single artifact revealing a cosmic hunter that forced the Anunnaki to hide on Earth. The historical record does not hand over such a confession in clean modern terms. What it offers instead is the opposite, a long, meticulous tradition of writing that often refuses to say what it seems to be preparing to say. The clay bears witness, but indirectly. The evidence is not a trumpet, it is a whisper that keeps stopping. There are, however, specific places where the whisper sharpens. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, when the heroes approach the cedar forest, the guardian Humbaba is described with a terror that feels strangely technical, a voice like flood, breath like death, a radiance that can paralyze. Some interpret this as poetic amplification, the typical intensification of an epic adversary. Others wonder why the descriptions linger on sensory effects, sound, breath, glare, rather than on the simple fact of violence. The text survives in multiple versions, with gaps and differences. Any attempt to read it as literal encounter collides with the reality of composition and transmission. And yet, the way the narrative frames the cedar forest as a restricted zone, watched, guarded, transgressive to enter, echoes the motif of sealed spaces and controlled thresholds. In other traditions, the threat is more cosmic. The Enuma Elish describes battle among the gods, the splitting of Tiamat, the formation of the world from a defeated body. Many scholars emphasize its theological and political function in Babylon, its celebration of Marduk's kingship. But the imagery of cosmic dismemberment and world-making from a slain adversary leaves an afterimage. Creation as the management of a dangerous remainder. The enemy becomes architecture. The predator becomes material. If that seems too abstract, the administrative and ritual texts pull the imagination back down to earth. Temples were not only places of devotion, they were institutions that controlled land, labor, and surplus. Their archives included offerings, inventories, and instructions, as well as prayers. Within such a system, hiding is not only a mythic act, it is also an administrative one, storing, sealing, restricting access, controlling who can see and who can speak. Seals mattered. Doors mattered. The difference between public recitation and private ritual mattered. And in the archaeological record, doors and seals recur like a theme, rooms sealed and reopened, foundation deposits buried beneath corners, statues interred, objects placed where they would not be seen again. These acts can be explained in ordinary terms of ritual practice. They can also be read, by those inclined to read them that way, as gestures of anxiety, as if the most powerful things should not remain exposed. Somewhere between those explanations, the investigation pauses. The title promises a tablet that reveals a predator and an earthbound refuge, The archive offers no single tablet that can be cited without caution, no line that can be translated into that modern claim without distortion. But it does offer something else: a consistent atmosphere of guardedness, a cosmos treated as active and sometimes hostile, and a literature that frames certain spaces, forests, seas, heavens, underworld gates, as zones where the ordinary rules break. In the museum storerooms and catalog lists, there are still fragments that do not yet belong to any joined composition. A sign here, a broken verb there, a line ending in a determinative that hints at a divine name, then nothing. The record thins out, and it is in that thinning where the text breaks, where the ritual becomes urgent, where the sky becomes a coded threat, that a question begins to take shape without demanding belief. If the Mesopotamian scribes were preserving an older fear inside their myth and ritual, they did not preserve it as a clean narrative. They preserved it as a set of precautions, as a habit of sealing, as an insistence that anomalies mattered. And in that insistence, one can almost hear the soundless corridor opening, leading not toward a monster with a modern label, but toward a missing line that many hands have tried to reconstruct, and that still refuses to sit still in the clay. The most persistent misunderstanding begins with a simple impulse: the wish for a single object that settles everything. A tablet, intact, a translation, decisive, a sentence that says plainly what later generations only half remember. Mesopotamia rarely grants that kind of clarity. The clay survives, but survival is uneven. A library collapses, a floor burns, water seeps into an archive, salt blooms under a museum's old storage conditions, and the text that remains is a mosaic: truth by approximation, certainty by repetition. When a revelation is claimed, the first question is always the same: where does the claim touch the actual corpus? For the Anunnaki, the corpus is wide and inconvenient. The term itself shifts across centuries and languages. In Sumerian contexts, the divine world is crowded: An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Utu, Nana, and many more. Later Akkadian traditions inherit, translate, and reshape these figures. Anunnaki can function as a collective label rather than a fixed roster. When modern imagination treats the word as a species or faction with a single unified agenda, the ancient texts resist. They do not read like science fiction. They read like city religion, ritual administration, and poetic memory. Yet resistance does not equal emptiness. The question becomes narrower: if a hidden threat is present, where might it leave fingerprints? The answer is rarely in myths alone. It is often in the literature of procedure: omens, incantations, apotropaic rituals, and the technical documents of scribal schools. These texts were copied, standardized, and consulted precisely because they were useful. They were not meant to dazzle, they were meant to work. Among the most striking categories are the celestial omen texts. The series, commonly known as Enuma Elish, assembled over long periods, copied and adapted by generations of scribes, treats the sky as a field of signals. The moon's behavior, the sun's color, the shape of a halo, the appearance of a star in a wrong season, each is attached to consequences on Earth. The consequences often involve kingship, famine, war, plague, rebellion. Modern readers sometimes recoil at the logic, but within the system, the logic is consistent. The cosmos is alive with intent, and the boundary between natural phenomenon and message is thin. A later scholar might ask whether the system is only projection, human anxiety smeared onto the heavens. Many would argue that it is. But even if projection is granted, the form of projection still matters. The omens do not frame the sky as neutral. They treat it as an arena of pressure, and they build an infrastructure of interpretation as though survival depends on it. In such a world, predators rarely appear with names. They appear as patterns that must be averted. The language of eating returns with stubborn frequency. Eclipses are sometimes described as the moon being seized or devoured. Darkness becomes an attacker. The sky becomes a mouth. There is no need to insist that this is literal to notice what it does to the imagination. It trains the mind to think of the heavens not as distant, but as capable of harm. Then come the rituals designed to answer those patterns. A particular kind of ceremony, often described as a namburbi ritual in Akkadian tradition, aims to undo an evil omen. The very existence of such rituals implies a belief that the future is not fixed, that harm can be diverted, diluted, or redirected. It is a theology of negotiation with threat. Some rituals use substitutes, objects or figures that absorb danger so that a person, often a king, does not. In the famous practice of the substitute king, a stand-in might occupy the throne for a period marked as dangerous, allowing the forecasted calamity to fall on the substitute rather than the ruler. Scholars debate the exact development and application of this practice, and the evidence varies by period. But the underlying concept is difficult to ignore. The system behaves as if something is hunting for an address, and the address can be falsified. This is where the title's cosmic predator begins to resemble a pattern rather than a creature. A predator in a myth can be slain. A predator in an omen system is different. It is an algorithm of misfortune. It is an incoming event with appetite. It is a harm that seems to look for a target. If the investigation stays with this pattern, another motif rises: sealed corridors. In Mesopotamian ritual life, thresholds are everywhere: doors, gates, city walls, the boundary between street and temple, the line between daylight and underworld. Myths describe divine journeys across these thresholds. Rituals attempt to regulate what passes through them. Protective figures, like the hybrid guardians placed at palaces and gates in Assyrian contexts, stand as carved warnings. Incantations speak directly to unseen intruders, ordering them away from houses, beds, and city streets. These are not rare eccentric practices, they are central. That centrality suggests a lived experience of vulnerability, a sense that the world is permeable. In modern terms, the system behaves like a civilization that has chosen to domesticate fear by giving it procedures: lists, recitations, gestures, seals. The temptation then is to connect this to a grand narrative that the gods themselves were hiding, and that humans were enlisted into the concealment. But the texts do not say that. They speak instead of gods who require offerings, who establish kings, who decree fates, who quarrel, who protect, who punish. They speak of divine assembly and cosmic order. They speak of disaster and complaint. The hiding that appears most clearly is not the hiding of gods, but the hiding of power. Power sealed into foundations, buried in deposits, tucked behind ritual language that is never fully explained to outsiders. An example lies in the very mechanics of scribal education. Many texts survive because they were copied in schools: lexical lists, sign lists, bilingual exercises, model contracts, and standard compositions. This means that what is preserved is partly what scribes needed to memorize. In such a system, what is withheld is just as telling. Not every ritual is written down. Some may have been transmitted orally or kept within narrow circles of expertise. Access to certain knowledge could be restricted for reasons that are practical, not sinister: sacredness, social control, specialized training, political sensitivity. The result, centuries later, is the same: corridors of missing instruction. So the investigation returns to the clay, but with a different expectation. The tablet in the title may not be a single artifact that declares a cosmic predator. It may be a kind of tablet, a class of texts that hint at the same pressure from different angles. An omen tablet that treats the sky as hostile, a ritual tablet that tries to divert an incoming harm, a myth tablet that frames certain regions as forbidden, a lexical list that preserves a word for an entity whose nature is no longer clear. In museum drawers, such tablets sit side by side without admitting they belong to one story. The modern mind wants to join them into a single narrative line: predator, pursuit, refuge, concealment. The ancient archive refuses to cooperate. It offers shards, and each shard is careful. Each is specific, none announces the grand design, and yet, in the gaps between them, something accumulates. A sense that the Mesopotamian cosmos was not merely inhabited by gods, but haunted by irregularities, events that did not fit human timing. The rituals do not feel like theater alone, they feel like a system built by repetition under pressure. If a predator is present, perhaps the predator is the pressure itself, the recurring need to misdirect, to seal, to avert, to interpret. Perhaps the hiding is not an act of cowardice, but a habit of survival embedded into religion and statecraft. The question then shifts quietly toward the oldest and loudest catastrophe in the archive, one that arrives not as a single line, but as a recurring tide. Flood. Not as geology alone, but as narrative obsession. A world overwhelmed, a decision made, a vessel built, a silence afterward. And in the flood traditions, the gods do something that does not quite resemble triumph. They become frightened. The texts do not always agree on why. Flood stories in Mesopotamia do not behave like a single tale that can be pinned to one tablet. They behave like a weather system, moving across centuries, changing pressure as it crosses different cities, languages, and political climates. The names shift, the motives shift, the moral framing shifts. What remains is the shape, a decision among gods, a warning to one human, a construction of a vessel, a deluge that unthreads the world, and an aftermath marked by hunger, regret, and uneasy recalibration. In the older Atrahasis tradition, preserved in Akkadian and reconstructed from broken clay, the flood is tied to a crisis of labor and noise. Humans multiply. Their clamor disturbs the divine realm. The high god Enlil seeks reduction. Plague, drought, famine, and finally flood. Enki, often the god of wisdom, waters, and craft, acts as the counterweight, finding a way to preserve a remnant. Scholars have long read this as a mythic reflection of social anxiety, population, resource strain, the fragility of agriculture, the experience of sudden catastrophe along river systems. That reading is strong. It does not require predators. And yet, even within this human centered logic, there are moments that look past humans entirely. The gods themselves are not composed. After the flood begins, the narrative describes them in states that are difficult to reconcile with omnipotence. They recoil. They cower like dogs. They gather in fear. The imagery is startling because it inverts the expected hierarchy. The flood, which is meant to be an instrument of divine policy, becomes something that shocks even its authors. Some researchers interpret this as a literary device, a way to dramatize the scale of disaster. Others see in it a deeper tension, an admission, perhaps unintended, that the forces unleashed are not fully controllable. In this view, the gods are not frightened of humans or of their own decree. They are frightened of a world that, once destabilized, behaves like an independent agent. The later flood narrative embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh carries similar tremors. Utnapishtim recounts the event to Gilgamesh as part of a larger meditation on mortality. The flood becomes a boundary line in time, before and after. The language again allows the gods to appear unsettled. Ishtar cries out. The divine assembly regrets. The gods gather around the offering afterward like flies, an image that is both earthy and humiliating. Many scholars understand this as a critique or a complication of divine justice. The gods are powerful but not always wise. They are capable of overreaction. They are bound by appetites. Here, the investigation has to move carefully. It is easy to take the gods' fear and hunger and turn it into an allegory for an external predator, something so terrifying that even the Anunnaki would hide. But the texts do not say this. They attribute the fear to the storm itself, to the chaos of the flood, to the consequences of divine decision. The safer approach is to treat the fear as a clue to worldview rather than as evidence of extraterrestrial pursuit. Still, A worldview can preserve the outline of an older pressure without naming it. Mesopotamian religion is full of beings that are not gods in the royal sense: demons, personified diseases, winds that carry malice, the restless dead, and hybrid entities that belong to borders. The Mesopotamian mind did not draw a simple line between natural and supernatural. Wind could be wind and also a carrier of something else. Darkness could be darkness and also an agent. An eclipse could be astronomy and also a seizure. Within such a framework, the idea of a cosmic predator does not need to be explicit to have a place. It would live as a category of incoming harm from beyond ordinary human control. There's another aspect of the flood traditions that opens a subtler corridor: the theme of secrecy and indirect speech. In Atrahasis, Enki does not announce his plan openly. He speaks to a wall. He instructs Atrahasis through an architectural surface, as if the very act of warning must be disguised. Scholars read this as a narrative trick. Enki can claim he did not directly disobey the divine assembly because he technically spoke to reeds or a partition. The story enjoys its own cleverness, but the mechanism is revealing. Important information is transmitted through oblique channels. The gods' assembly is not simply a council, it is a regime of control. To preserve life, one must speak sideways. That sideways speech mirrors the archive itself. So much of Mesopotamian knowledge reaches later centuries through indirect survival. A fragment from Nineveh that preserves a Babylonian version of a story that itself reworks an older Sumerian tradition. Each layer adds uncertainty. Each layer also adds motive for omission. A scribe might copy a text but soften a detail that no longer fits the theology of his city. A ritual specialist might write down only what is safe to circulate. A library might preserve official narratives while leaving more marginal or dangerous texts to perish. This is not conspiracy. It is ordinary institutional behavior. Archives are shaped by what they choose to keep. If the title's tablet is imagined as a buried confession, the flood text suggests another possibility. The confession is not a statement, but a posture. The posture is that even gods must negotiate with forces that can slip beyond their decree. When the world is unmade by water and wind, the divine assembly behaves less like masters and more like administrators confronted with a runaway process. For some modern interpreters, this posture invites a larger speculation: that Mesopotamian gods are a memory of powerful beings who were not fully in control of the environment they shaped. This idea appears in various popular theories and is widely disputed in academic contexts, where myth is understood as cultural expression rather than disguised reportage. The dispute matters. The clay supports cultural readings far more reliably than it supports literal ones. Yet the investigation is not required to choose a literal reading to notice the tension in the narrative logic. The flood is framed as punishment, but the scale is excessive. The gods regret not because the punishment fails, but because it succeeds too completely. The regret is not moral clarity, it is operational discomfort. A system that destroys its own labor force destabilizes itself. The gods hunger because humans are gone. The cosmos in these texts is not a closed loop of perfection. It is a system with dependencies. A predator in such a system could be anything that exploits dependency. If humans can be erased and the gods can be left hungry, then the gods are not isolated beings floating above the world. They are entwined with it. Their power does not exempt them from consequence. That entwining makes the idea of hiding on Earth feel less absurd, not as a literal bunker scenario, but as a mythic truth. Gods are local. They belong to cities, rivers, mountains, temples. Their presence is anchored. When danger comes, it comes into the same space. The flood texts also point toward a crucial detail. The sky and the sea are not stable. They can become hostile quickly. The horizon can turn into an advancing wall. The wind can become a weapon. If the ancient mind can imagine the world itself acting like an attacker, then a cosmic predator may be less a beast and more a condition, an episode when the cosmos turns predatory. But if that is the case, Then why do later texts work so hard to interpret signs in the heavens? Why the obsession with eclipses, comets, strange stars, and halos? Why treat the sky as a place where danger announces itself in advance? Because danger in this system is not random, it has a signature. The next corridor leads away from the floodwaters and upward into the cold bookkeeping of the sky, where scribes recorded anomalies that might not fit any season, signs that arrive, are feared, and then are buried again in clay. To look for a signature in Mesopotamian sources is to accept a particular kind of evidence, not a narrative confession, but a catalog of disturbances. The omen texts do not tell stories in the way epics do. They arrange the world into if-then sequences. If the moon is eclipsed in a certain month, then a king will die. If a halo surrounds the sun with a break in the ring, then rebellion will rise in a particular direction. If a star appears where it should not, then famine will follow. The logic can feel mechanical, but the fear is intimate. The sky is treated like a surface that can be read for approaching harm. Modern astronomy can often identify the physical basis for many observations: eclipses, planetary conjunctions, comets, atmospheric halos. That does not cancel the omen system, it contextualizes it. The scribes were working within a worldview in which events above and events below were connected by law, not coincidence. What matters for this investigation is the intensity of attention. A civilization that invests so heavily in reading anomalies is a civilization that feels exposed. There are practical explanations. Kings depended on stability. An omen interpreted as danger could justify ritual action, political purges, military caution, diplomatic delay. Omen interpretation could function as a tool of governance. This is not a cynical claim. It is an observation about how knowledge systems work in courts. Even today, forecasts, economic, meteorological, epidemiological, shape policy. Mesopotamia built its own forecast system with the materials available: observation, precedent, and ritual response. Entries describe the heavens behaving in. Entries describe the heavens behaving in ways that are difficult to parse from the surviving fragments. A tablet might mention a star that grows bright, or a light that appears and disappears, or an irregular darkness. Translation is complicated. Words can be ambiguous. Terms for celestial objects do not map neatly onto modern categories. A line that looks like a meteor could also be poetic shorthand for something else. A damaged sign can shift meaning. The safest posture is humility. The record is not clean enough to support extravagant claims. Still, it is possible to observe without overclaiming. The omen corpus includes a strong theme of intrusion. Not merely change, but intervention. The sky is imagined as a realm where forces can seize, strike, cover, devour. Even the grammatical choices matter. The moon does not simply disappear, it is attacked. The sun does not simply dim, it is obscured as if by intent. The effect is to make the heavens feel less like background and more like a corridor through which harm can move. If a cosmic predator is to be framed responsibly, it should be framed at this level, as a category in the Mesopotamian imagination for external, incoming threat that reveals itself through anomalies and that can sometimes be deflected through ritual procedure. Anything beyond that would require evidence the corpus does not clearly provide. The ritual response is where the fear becomes architectural. When an evil omen is detected, the response is not only prayer, it can involve complex procedures: cleansing, offerings, recitations, symbolic transfers. The goal is often expressed as undoing the omen. The ritual language sometimes treats the omen as a tangible thing that can be carried away, washed off, redirected. The cosmos is seen as responsive to properly executed action. Some scholars emphasize that this is not unique to Mesopotamia. Many cultures develop apotropaic and divinatory systems, but Mesopotamia's surviving record is unusually extensive, and the system's bureaucratic flavor is pronounced. It is as if the threat is constant enough to demand paperwork. At the same time, the mythology provides a broader frame for why anomalies matter. Divine assemblies decide fates. Gods move through the sky. The planet gods, associated with visible planets, wander. The sun and moon are not merely lights, they are deities with agency. In such a worldview, an anomaly is not merely physics, it is diplomacy and conflict among powers. And conflict among powers is exactly what later Mesopotamian mythic and theological texts are willing to imagine at cosmic scale. The creation epic depicts battle and order making through violence. Other narratives describe divine disputes over kingship and city fortunes. The cosmos is not stable, it is managed. A managed cosmos implies the possibility of management failure. Here, the investigation approaches a delicate edge. Some modern speculative theories argue that the gods' management language is an echo of technologically advanced beings interacting with early humans. Academically, this is generally rejected because it imposes modern categories onto ancient texts and ignores the cultural functions of myth. The safer interpretation is that the gods are a poetic way of talking about the forces that shape life. River floods, drought, war, disease, social hierarchy. The gods are the human mind's way of making those forces negotiable. But even within a symbolic reading, the motifs of restricted access and sealed knowledge remain significant. If the cosmos is a managed system, then access to management tools, rituals, incantations, omen interpretation becomes power, and power tends to be restricted. This restriction appears not only in who could read and write, but in how knowledge was organized. Some texts are explicitly secret or intended for specialized practitioners. The evidence for secrecy varies by period and context, and scholars argue about how formalized it was. But the very existence of specialized corpora, medical, exorcistic, divinatory, points toward guarded corridors of expertise. Knowledge is not evenly distributed. It is held, transmitted, and sometimes withheld. The title's idea that something forced the Anunnaki to hide can be reinterpreted within this reality. Perhaps the hiding is not physical refuge, but institutional concealment, the practice of sealing dangerous knowledge inside restricted traditions. A predator, in this framing, is not an alien creature, but a class of threat so destabilizing that it must be controlled by knowledge management. The gods, in the narratives, embody that management. The humans, scribes, priests, exorcists, participate in it. But an investigation cannot stop at interpretation. It has to touch ground again. It needs an artifact, a place, something with weight. The ground in Mesopotamia offers sealed spaces in abundance: graves, foundation deposits, caches, buried objects beneath corners and thresholds. These are not mysterious in themselves. Archaeologists have long documented such practices, but they create a physical parallel to the textual motif, the instinct to place powerful things where they are not meant to be seen. When later excavators broke into Assyrian palaces and temples, they found protective figures, sometimes inscribed, placed at entrances. They found ritual deposits. They found rooms that felt like compartments. Some of these were for storage, some were for administration, some may have held ritual objects. The presence of guardians and deposits suggests that the threshold was not just a door, it was a vulnerability. A vulnerability implies a threat with direction. If the threat is believed to come from the sky, then the sky becomes the primary corridor. The omen texts watch it, the rituals answer it, the myths explain it, the architecture protects against it. And yet there is another corridor that runs parallel to the sky: the underworld. Mesopotamian texts often describe a realm below, ruled by different powers, governed by different rules. The Anunnaki, in some later traditions, are associated with that realm as judges. The underworld is a place of dust, silence, and sealed gates. It is also a place where the dead go and do not return, except in some rituals, as restless intruders. A predator could come from above or below. The archive is haunted by both directions, and in the narrow space between them, between sky omens and underworld incantations, there's a third class of beings, neither god nor human, that the texts treat with special caution: the Utukku, the Galu, the Lilu, and other entities whose definitions are slippery and whose behavior is consistently invasive. The next corridor opens into the exorcistic texts, where the language stops being cosmic and becomes domestic. A sickbed, a doorway, a child's breath, a shadow on a wall. The scale shrinks, but the fear becomes sharper, as if the predator has found a way to enter the house. In the exorcistic literature, danger stops wearing the sky as a mask. It takes up residence closer to the skin. A child fails to sleep. A fever rises without a wound. A household feels suddenly heavy, as if air has thickened. The texts that answer these moments are not composed like epics. They do not seek admiration. They seek effect. They name intrusive forces, command them, bargain with them, confuse them, and, above all, try to push them back across the boundary they have crossed. Many of these compositions survive in Akkadian, often associated with the professional world of the Ashipu, the exorcist priest. The evidence for how these practitioners worked comes from tablets that preserve incantations, ritual instructions, and diagnostic series. Some texts catalog symptoms and link them to unseen agents. Others prescribe sequences of actions: fumigation, washing, offerings, figurines, recitations. The archive is large enough to show that this was not an occasional superstition. It was a sustained knowledge tradition. It is also an archive of language that treats intrusion as a central problem. A force enters a body, a house, a city. It settles, it feeds, it clings, it moves at night. In these texts, the predator is not a single celebrated monster. It is a class of behaviors: creeping, attaching, consuming vitality, disturbing the mind, pressing down on breath. The names used in these contexts are numerous and not always stable. Terms like utuku, alu, galu, lilu, and others appear across different compositions, sometimes overlapping, sometimes distinct. Translation is careful work here, because the categories do not align neatly with later demonologies. Some terms may refer to ghosts, some to personified diseases, some to mythic agents associated with particular gods. Some may have functioned more as labels for symptoms than as descriptions of beings. Accounts conflict. The sources thin out exactly where certainty would be easiest. Yet, even in uncertainty, certain motifs repeat with insistence. Many incantations focus on the doorway, the threshold, the crack in a wall, the window, the street corner at night. The house is imagined not as a sealed private space, but as a porous structure surrounded by movement: wind, dust, voices, spirits, disease. Protection is not assumed. It must be built and renewed, sometimes daily, with words and substances and gestures. The language of sealing returns again. Ritual instructions sometimes involve placing objects at entrances, marking boundaries, or burying figurines at corners. In some traditions, protective images were set into walls or near gates. The purpose is rarely described as aesthetic. It is defense. A house becomes a small fortress against a world that does not stop pressing. This domestic defense echoes the grander architectural habits seen in palaces and temples. The difference is scale, not logic. The same universe that produces eclipses and floods also produces the nighttime intruder that sits on a sleeper's chest, the sickness that arrives like a visitor and refuses to leave. The cosmos is not divided into myth and medicine. It is one continuous environment with multiple angles of approach. For the investigation implied by the title, this matters because it provides a plausible bridge between cosmic and predator without forcing a literal creature into the evidence. The exorcistic texts show that Mesopotamians had a mature vocabulary for predation as invasion. Harm was often imagined as an entity that comes from elsewhere, enters, and feeds. Whether that imagination maps onto actual pathogens and psychological experiences, or onto a metaphysical landscape, is a separate debate. The texts themselves do not require a modern decision. They operate as though both could be true at once. A second bridge appears in the way these texts treat divine authority. Exorcistic incantations often invoke major gods: Enki/Ea, Asaluhi/Marduk, Shamash, and others, as patrons of cleansing and judgment. The practitioner speaks in a voice backed by cosmic order. The intruder is not simply chased away, it is tried, named, shamed, and reassigned to its proper domain. The language suggests jurisdiction. It suggests that even hostile forces exist within a hierarchy, unless they are the kind of forces that cannot be named cleanly, the ones described only as evil, unknown, strange. The unknown category is the most revealing. When a text admits that the agent is not certain, it does not abandon the ritual. It broadens it. It lists multiple possible intruders. It recites against any evil that may be present. The system anticipates ambiguity and builds procedures to survive it. Such procedures can be read as simple pragmatism. When a child is ill, any available remedy is tried, but the persistence of the same patterns across tablets suggests something more. A worldview shaped by repeated encounters with events that felt like invasions. Sudden, disruptive, difficult to predict, and sometimes lethal. If a cosmic predator were to be expressed through this worldview, it would not necessarily appear as a new named demon. It might appear as an escalation, an intrusion so large that it is recorded in the sky, so severe that it reorganizes myths, so recurrent that it becomes embedded in ritual practice, and so difficult to define that the record defaults to procedural defense rather than description. The title's phrase, forced to hide on Earth, still cannot be treated as a claim supported by these texts. What can be supported is a more cautious proposition that Mesopotamian literature repeatedly frames existence as life inside a permeable world, where threats arrive from beyond visible boundaries, where knowledge is guarded, and where protection depends on managing thresholds, physical and linguistic. Language itself becomes a threshold. Many incantations rely on repetition, on lists, on formulaic sequences. The words do not merely represent, they act. In that sense, the text is not a passive record, it is a tool, and tools, in institutional settings, are controlled. Tablets that preserve professional knowledge were copied, stored, and transmitted within circles of training. Some were meant for school, some for practitioners, some might have been kept in temple libraries, some were private copies. The chain of custody is often impossible to reconstruct, but the overall picture remains. Knowledge does not spread evenly, it moves through corridors. Corridors can be restricted without any dramatic story of suppression. A temple does not need to hide the truth to limit access. It only needs to maintain its own function. But to later eyes, those ordinary restrictions produce the sensation of a sealed archive, a vast field of writing with doors that do not open. At times, the record hints at those doors. Colophons, scribal notes at the ends of tablets, sometimes name the scribe, the owner, the city, the purpose. Some note that a text is copied for learning. Some suggest it belongs to a professional corpus. Sometimes a line survives that implies a tradition, a lineage, a transmission of expertise. These notes do not announce cosmic predators, but they do confirm the reality of controlled knowledge. And the most controlled knowledge tends to be knowledge about threat. There is another feature of exorcistic tradition that pulls the investigation back toward the Anunnaki word itself. In certain contexts, divine assemblies and underworld authorities are invoked as judges. The underworld is described as a place of dust and silence, but also of law. If the Anunnaki function there as judges in some texts, then they are not merely distant sky gods. They are part of a system that processes the dead and polices boundaries. A judge is not a hiding figure. A judge is a figure of control. But control suggests a reason to control. If the underworld requires judges, then the dead are not simply gone. They are managed. If intruders must be exorcised, then the boundary between living and dead is not perfectly sealed. If the sky must be read for omens, then the boundary between heaven and earth is also not sealed. The universe, in these texts, looks like a house whose doors keep rattling. The question then becomes quieter and more precise. What kinds of rattling were so disturbing that the scribes built such elaborate systems to interpret and repel them? Some rattling can be explained by climate and disease, some by war and political instability, some by the lived fear of night and loss. But there are also rattles that appear in the intersection between omen and ritual, moments when the sky signals danger, the ritual answers urgently, and the mythic imagination frames the cosmos as a managed battlefield. If the title's tablet is ever to be approached responsibly, it will likely be found where those intersections are densest, in the technical series that join celestial observation to terrestrial crisis, and in the ritual texts that assume danger can be redirected as if it has intent. The archive begins to suggest a troubling possibility. The predator does not need a face, it only needs a route, and the routes sky, threshold, dream, disease, underworld gate are already mapped. Somewhere in that map, certain names recur with unusual gravity. Not only gods and demons, but the great winds, the storms, and the entities that ride them. The next corridor leads into those winds, where disaster is described not as an accident, but as a presence moving across land with hunger, leaving sealed rooms behind it. Wind is one of the oldest metaphors in Mesopotamia, and one of the most literal. It arrives without a footstep. It crosses borders without negotiation. It slips through reed walls and unsealed doors, and it does not leave a clear mark of entry. For people living between rivers, in a landscape where dust can rise like smoke and storms can turn day into a bruised dusk, wind is not an abstraction. It is a force that can ruin crops, collapse fragile structures, and carry illness through crowded streets. In the written record, wind becomes more than weather. It becomes a corridor. Mesopotamian texts speak of winds as agents that can be sent, restrained, or redirected. Sometimes the wind is simply the domain of a god, associated with storm and atmosphere, with thunder, with the violence of rain. Sometimes it is treated as the medium through which misfortune travels. In incantations and rituals, the language grows sharper. Harm can ride the wind. Evil can be blown into a house. A sickness can come like the wind, sudden and unseen, and once it arrives, it clings as if it has purpose. Modern readers often want a single name to anchor this. The archive offers names, but not in the way a modern thriller would. It offers a network of figures, some divine, some demonic, some ambiguous, linked by behavior rather than by fixed taxonomy. What is consistent is the idea that a force can move through air with intent, and that this movement requires countermeasures. Among the most widely discussed images from later Mesopotamian periods is the figure commonly called Pazuzu, often represented with a hybrid body and an animal-like face, sometimes with wings, sometimes with a scorpion tail. The surviving evidence shows that this figure was used in apotropaic contexts, especially in the first millennium BCE, and is frequently connected to protection against harmful winds and against a feared female figure often called Lamashtu. The details are complex. The textual and archaeological record suggests variations in how these beings were imagined and deployed. Scholars debate the precise development of their cultic and magical roles, but the central point remains. Wind is not neutral in these traditions, and protection can come from an image that looks like the thing it repels. This logic is unsettling in a quiet way. It implies that the best defense against an invasive corridor is not a gentle barrier, but a controlled imitation. A terrifying mask is placed at the threshold to discourage a more terrifying visitor. An object is hung, buried, or worn, not because the object is beautiful, but because it signals jurisdiction. It says, this space is claimed. If the title's imagined predator is treated as a pressure that forces hiding, then the apotropaic world supplies a sober translation. When danger is believed to come through the air, the response is to reshape the air's boundaries with symbols, words, and sealed deposits. It is not hiding in a cave. It is building a system of filters. There is another way wind becomes a predator in Mesopotamian thought, through epidemic experience. The historical record, fragmented as it is, indicates recurring disease and mortality in ancient cities. Specific outbreaks are difficult to reconstruct with confidence. Some royal inscriptions and letters mention illness. Administrative disruptions can hint at crises, but exact identification of pathogens is usually impossible. The ancient texts classify sickness through symptom clusters and through spiritual attributions, sometimes blending both. A fever may be a fever and also a seizure by an unseen force. A rash may be a rash and also a sign of curse. This is not confusion so much as a different ontology. Causation can be layered. Within that ontology, wind becomes a natural carrier for what cannot be seen. A plague moves like air. It enters where it pleases. It does not respect gates. It can be counted only after it has passed, by the silence it leaves. Silence is one of the deepest motifs in these materials. After disaster, flood, drought, war, illness, the texts often describe cities as quiet, temples as abandoned, streets as empty. Laments over ruined cities, especially in Sumerian tradition, render devastation as a withdrawal of sound. The laughter is gone, the songs are gone, the daily noise that once proved life is gone. The poetic power of these laments has many possible explanations: political catastrophe, conquest, forced displacement, the collapse of economic networks. But the imagery of silence also behaves like a signature of predation. A predator does not only kill, it quiets. When the archive is read with care, this quieting appears again and again as an endpoint. A city can be covered as if by a blanket. A land can be swallowed. A storm can strip the country. The verbs are bodily. The earth is treated as something that can be consumed. The temptation is to turn bodily verbs into literal beings. Some modern readings do exactly that, interpreting metaphor as memory of an external entity. Academic approaches generally resist this move, emphasizing genre, tradition, and the symbolic function of personification. The caution is necessary. But the investigation can remain within responsible boundaries while still noticing the pattern. Mesopotamian language repeatedly frames catastrophe as consumption by an agent that approaches from outside normal visibility. This pattern becomes sharper when the record shows how practitioners tried to respond. A significant portion of ritual and incantation literature is not about honoring gods in times of peace, but about emergency procedures: how to avert an evil sign, how to cleanse a house after a nightmare, how to treat a sickness that has no obvious cause, how to drive away a presence that presses down at night. Even if these rituals also serve social cohesion and professional authority, their existence implies a culture that experienced threat as recurrent and invasive. The cosmic aspect returns at the moment the wind is linked to the sky. Storm and eclipse, dust and omen, plague and astral warning. These pairings appear in different places across the corpus. The sky signals danger, the wind delivers it. The ritual tries to intercept it. The myth gives it a place in cosmic politics. This begins to resemble a layered defense system, one built not against a single enemy but against the possibility of intrusion itself. In that sense, hiding becomes less a dramatic flight and more a design principle. Powerful spaces, temples, palaces, even ordinary homes are treated as needing insulation, not only with walls, but with words, not only with doors, but with deposits, not only with guards, but with images designed to frighten what cannot be reasoned with. Archaeology sometimes confirms the habit of hidden protection. Figurines and amulets have been found in contexts that suggest deliberate placement under floors, in walls, near thresholds. The precise interpretation of each find depends on context and is often debated. Some placements may be later disturbances. Some objects may have moved. But enough evidence exists across sites and periods to support a cautious statement. Mesopotamians sometimes placed protective objects in concealed positions as part of ritual practice. The protection is meant to operate unseen. The object does not need an audience. It needs a location. That detail matters. It implies that threat is imagined to move through spaces that are not always visible. Under floors, through cracks, along corners, in the night air. A predator that uses such routes would not be fought in open battle. it would be countered by hidden infrastructure. From there, the corridor bends back toward the idea of gods forced into local anchoring. If divine power is associated with temples, and temples are sealed with hidden deposits, then divinity itself becomes entangled with concealment. The god is not only worshipped, the god's space is fortified. The sacred is not only elevated, it is secured. This does not prove that any Anunnaki hid on Earth in a literal sense, but it does support a quieter proposition that Mesopotamian religion and ritual repeatedly model the world as a place where even the highest orders of power must manage intrusion. The sky can threaten, the wind can carry harm, the house can be entered, the city can be quieted. And yet, for all this attention to defense, the texts also preserve an unnerving admission. Sometimes the agent is not named. Sometimes the ritual is performed against whatever evil is present. Sometimes the practitioner speaks into uncertainty and hopes the words find the right target. That uncertainty is the closest thing the archive offers to a blank space shaped like a predator. It is a place where language reaches for definition and fails, and where procedure replaces description. In that blank space, a specific question begins to press harder than before, not about monsters, but about chronology. When, in the deep record, does the sense of incoming intrusion intensify? When do the protective systems grow more elaborate? When do the texts begin to speak as if the corridors have multiplied? The next corridor leads into the first millennium's vast machinery of protection, palace thresholds lined with hybrid guardians, rooms arranged like controlled passageways, and libraries that collected not only myths, but the technical manuals for surviving the unseen. Because somewhere inside those manuals, the record grows unusually careful about what must not be allowed to enter. The first millennium BCE leaves a different texture in the ground. Earlier centuries left city mounds and broken foundations, but the first millennium, especially in Assyria and later Babylonia, left corridors that still feel planned. Palaces stretched with long, controlled approaches. Gateways narrowed movement into specific channels. Rooms were arranged to manage who could pass and who could not. Even without imagining invisible threats, the architecture expresses a political truth. Power prefers filtration. At sites like Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, Khorsabad, Dur-Sharrukin, and Nineveh, excavators found palaces built on scale that makes ordinary human life feel small. Colossal guardian figures, human-headed winged bulls or lions, often called lamasu in modern usage, stood at entrances. Their purpose is widely understood as protective and symbolic. They project royal authority, intimidate enemies, and guard thresholds in a ritual sense. Inscriptions often combine blessing and warning. The figures are placed where passage concentrates, where bodies and intentions must be sorted. It is easy to read these guardians as theatrical. They certainly are. They are also practical in their own vocabulary. The threshold is where danger enters. The threshold is where the king is most vulnerable. The threshold is where the unseen becomes close enough to touch. The guardians are an answer, carved permanence set against mobile threat. Inside such palaces, the archive becomes visible again, rooms that held writing. At Nineveh, the library associated with Ashurbanipal was not a quiet study in the modern sense. It was an instrument of statecraft and sacred management. Ashurbanipal's inscriptions present him as a learned king, proud of his ability to read and understand scholarly texts. The collecting of tablets served multiple functions: prestige, control of knowledge, access to ritual and divinatory expertise, and perhaps the consolidation of cultural memory. The library's contents, reconstructed from thousands of fragments, included myths and epics, but also the technical corpora that treat the world as a field of hazards, omens, rituals, incantations, medical texts, lexical lists. It is within this environment, where knowledge is gathered like weaponry, that the idea of a gap that shouldn't exist becomes more tangible. Because a library that extensive should, in theory, preserve everything that mattered to its compilers. Yet the surviving corpus still has silences. Some compositions are known only by title or by passing reference. Some are represented by fragments too small to identify. Some exist in multiple versions that disagree where one would most want them to agree. The clay offers abundance, and then it offers a sudden broken edge. The pattern repeats so often that it begins to feel like a feature rather than an accident. Knowledge is present, but it arrives through narrowing corridors. There are gentle, ordinary reasons for this. Tablets were broken during the sack of Nineveh in 612 BCE. Many were already broken before that. Many were discarded. Many were copied from older sources that had their own lacunae. Some may never have been collected. Some may have existed in perishable formats. And even a careful scribe could miscopy, omit, or correct a line to fit a preferred tradition. The result is not a clean loss with a single cause. It is an ecology of disappearance. Still, what remains is enough to show that the first millennium was not relaxed about unseen threat. If anything, it was obsessed with it. One of the most striking bodies of evidence is the practice of embedding protective figurines and deposits within buildings. Archaeological finds and textual instructions suggest that figurines representing protective beings could be buried beneath floors, placed in walls, or set near thresholds as part of apotropaic rites. The exact procedures vary, and not every find can be linked confidently to a specific ritual text. Context can be disturbed, objects can move. But the overall convergence of archaeology and ritual literature supports a cautious conclusion. Protection was sometimes installed like infrastructure, hidden inside architecture to work without being seen. This is where the title's sense of hiding can be translated into something historically grounded. In Mesopotamia, what is most powerful is often placed where it is least visible. A protective object is not displayed for admiration. It is buried where a harmful force is imagined to pass. The defense is not a public performance. It is a sealed decision. The same logic appears in the textual tools of protection. Many incantation series are formulaic, but the formula does not mean the fear is shallow. Repetition can be an index of urgency. A line is repeated because it is believed to matter. A name is invoked again and again because it is believed to carry authority. The practitioner speaks as if the unseen listens. And sometimes the practitioner speaks as if the unseen cannot be trusted to keep to one identity. The incantations can stack categories, whether the intruder is a ghost, a demon, a curse, a sorcery attack, an evil wind, an unnamed evil. The ritual net is widened to catch whatever is moving. That widening is a clue. It suggests that the experience of harm often arrived without a clear label, forcing the system to build a defense that could function under uncertainty. If a predator exists in this picture, it is defined by that uncertainty. It does not present itself as a heralded enemy. It arrives as a disturbance that resists classification. The response, accordingly, is not a single heroic act, but the construction of layered procedures, omens to detect, rituals to avert, deposits to seal, guardians to intimidate, archives to preserve the instructions. Even the act of collecting text can be seen as defensive. To possess the omen series is to possess the ability to read the sky. To possess the namburbi rituals is to possess the ability to respond. To possess the exorcistic corpora is to possess the ability to cleanse what enters. Knowledge becomes the inner wall behind the outer wall. This is not yet the title's promised revelation. It is something quieter. The recognition that the civilization most associated with the cradle of writing used writing partly as a shield, but shields imply an anticipated blow. The first millennium record also reveals an intense preoccupation with the king's vulnerability. The king is the axis on which order turns. Many omens focus on his fate. Many rituals aim to protect him specifically. The substitute king practice, in which a stand-in temporarily receives the danger forecast by an omen, shows a worldview where misfortune behaves like a directed strike. If the strike can be diverted to a substitute, then the strike has directionality. It is not random weather. It is not merely statistical bad luck. It is an incoming hazard with an address. That address-seeking logic feels close to predation. At the same time, the archive refuses to let the hazard be reduced to a single monster. It is too distributed. It arrives through eclipse and dream, through wind and sickness, through rumor and rebellion. It touches the political and the bodily. It belongs to sky and street. And here the investigation returns to the title's central contradiction. A Sumerian tablet cannot easily reveal a cosmic predator in modern terms, because most of the richly preserved technical corpora are Akkadian in the first millennium, copied in Assyrian and Babylonian contexts, often from older sources. The Sumerian layer is earlier, and its survival is more fragmentary. If one insists on a Sumerian artifact as the key, the search must turn toward the compositions that survived from Sumerian tradition and continued to be copied. Laments, myths, hymns, king lists, and lexical materials that carried old words forward. The question becomes, is there a point in the older Sumerian material where the record seems to flinch, where it gestures toward a threat that later traditions manage with procedures rather than narrative? One candidate corridor runs through the laments over ruined cities. These texts describe destruction with an intensity that feels like memory. They often present catastrophe as something sent by divine decree, carried by storm, enforced by fate. Yet the laments also contain moments where agency blurs. The storm behaves like a being. The city becomes prey. The people become scattered like birds. Sound disappears. The gods withdraw, and with them the protective order that made daily life possible. Scholars generally interpret these laments as responses to real historical trauma, especially the fall of the third dynasty of Ur at the end of the third millennium BCE and the collapse of its political order. That historical grounding is strong and does not need predators. But the laments language is older than any one event. It taps into a deep reservoir, the sense that catastrophe can come as a sweeping presence that silences everything and leaves no one to argue. If that presence is not a predator, it behaves like one. And that behavior matters because it forms a bridge between the poetic Sumerian world and the technical first millennium world. The older texts describe the world being swallowed by storm and decree. The later texts build manuals for detecting and averting similar swallowing. The thread connecting them is not a single creature. It is a recurring fear of being erased by something that moves through the corridors of the cosmos. The next corridor narrows again, away from palace guardians and buried figurines, toward a different kind of artifact. Not a myth tablet meant to be recited, but a lexical and scholarly tablet meant to define words, because sometimes the sharpest clue is not a story, but a term whose meaning refuses to stay stable, as if it was designed to be carried forward without being fully explained. A lexical tablet is a quiet object. It does not plead. It does not boast. It does not perform the way an epic performs. It sits in the hand with the calmness of a tool, offering lists of signs and their equivalents, words and their translations, categories arranged as if order can be pressed into clay. For modern readers, lexical lists can feel dry, like the scaffolding of a language rather than the language itself. But in Mesopotamia, the scaffolding mattered. It was how the scribal world stabilized meaning across centuries of change. And because it stabilized meaning, it also preserved ambiguities. Sumerian and Akkadian scribal education depended on lists. Signs were learned, values were memorized, equivalences were practiced. Some lists paired Sumerian words with Akkadian translations. Some grouped terms by theme: animals, stones, professions, gods, places. The goal was competence, but the side effect was preservation. A rare word that might vanish from ordinary speech could survive in a list because a student had to copy it. This matters because certain categories of beings, those that hover between divine, demonic, and descriptive, often appear most clearly in these scholarly environments. Not always with full explanations, sometimes only as a name in a gloss, as if the scribe expected the initiated to know more than the clay could hold. When modern translators face such terms, they must choose approximations. The choices can differ. The record grows quiet at the level of definition. In this corridor, the question is not, where is the predator named, but where does language preserve the shape of a threat without committing to its description? A term can function like a sealed door. It can be passed from hand to hand while remaining partly closed. The most obvious examples are the many words for intrusive agents in incantation literature, terms that appear in series and lists, sometimes grouped, sometimes contrasted. But there are other, subtler places where the archive's caution shows. The underworld is one, the heavens are another. Between them lies a vocabulary of boundary beings, watchers, gatekeepers, roaming forces, emissaries of illness, carriers of curse. Some are explicitly tied to particular gods. Some are defined only by action, the one who seizes, the one who strikes, the one who binds, the one who drinks life. A predator, if present, would likely be preserved in this action based way. Mesopotamian texts often define dangerous beings by what they do rather than what they are. This is practical. If something attacks breath, it is treated as a breath attacker, whether it has a stable name or not. The system cares about behavior because behavior is what must be countered. Lexical lists, in turn, can preserve clusters of such terms in close proximity. A student copying the list may not fully grasp the theological weight, but the list carries forward the fact that these categories existed, that they mattered enough to be taught, and that the tradition insisted on their distinctness, even when modern readers struggle to see it. This is the point where modern imagination often rushes in. A cluster of poorly understood terms becomes an invitation to invention. A gap in definition becomes a space to pour new stories. The title's Cosmic Predator is an example of how modern language can fill an ancient silence. The challenge, for a restrained investigation, is to treat the silence as silence, and to ask what kind of civilization produces so many controlled words for intrusion. One answer is simply that Mesopotamian life was precarious. Disease, infant mortality, war, crop failure, flood, drought, and political collapse were recurring realities. The unseen needed names because the causes of suffering were often invisible. Personification offered a handle. Ritual offered a response. Writing offered preservation. Nothing cosmic is required. Another answer does not contradict the first, but deepens it. Precarious life does not only generate fear, it generates institutions designed to manage fear. The scribal tradition becomes an institution of control. It classifies the world so it can be acted upon. In this sense, lexical lists are not neutral. They are part of a defensive architecture, like hidden figurines under a threshold. They place categories into order so that specialists can recognize and address them. When the archive is read this way, certain forms of erasure become more noticeable. Not erasure as deliberate suppression, but erasure as institutional narrowing. Complex experiences are compressed into technical language. Oral nuance is reduced to signs. Local variations are standardized. Uncomfortable contradictions are smoothed. Over centuries, a living fear can become a fixed entry in a list, a name with no story attached. That is how a predator could survive without surviving. If a force once felt vivid, it might later become only a term used in a ritual formula, and later still become only a word preserved in a lexical list. The story thins out. The procedure remains. The procedure is taught. The student copies the term without knowing what it once described. The clay continues to carry it forward like a fossil. At this point, the investigation brushes against another class of artifacts that sit between story and list: scholarly commentaries and explanatory texts. In the first millennium, scholars produced commentaries on older compositions, sometimes unpacking rare words, sometimes linking lines to omen logic, sometimes explaining divine names and equivalences. These commentaries can be tantalizing because they show how later experts interpreted older texts, but they also complicate everything. A commentary is not the original voice. It is a later mind speaking through an older line. It can preserve a tradition. It can also reshape it. In some cases, commentaries reveal that scholars themselves were wrestling with ambiguity. They offer multiple interpretations. They note variants. They tie words to other words. This is not the posture of people holding a single secret. It is the posture of people trying to keep a complex inheritance coherent. Their effort, however, produces its own kind of concealment. When something is too dangerous, too sacred, or too uncertain, it may be encoded in technical equivalences rather than described openly. This brings the investigation back to the title's sense of a gap in the record that shouldn't exist. In a culture that loved lists, gaps are suspicious. A list implies completeness, but no list is truly complete. The act of listing can create the illusion that everything is accounted for, even as it hides what has slipped away. So the question becomes, where do the lists and commentaries gesture towards something that does not sit comfortably inside their categories? One place is the boundary between gods and demons. Mesopotamian thought did not always draw a strict moral line between divine and demonic. A god can send sickness as punishment. A demon can be used for protection against another demon. A terrifying image can repel terror. The categories overlap. This overlap makes the idea of a single predator less likely and more diffuse. The threat may not be an outsider at all. It may be an internal feature of the cosmic order, something that periodically turns predatory, the way a river can periodically turn lethal. Another place is the language of fate and decree. Many texts speak of decrees fixed by the divine assembly, yet rituals exist to undo omens, to avert decreed harm, to divert fate. The system contains a contradiction. Fate is fixed, but fate can be negotiated. The contradiction is not a mistake. It is a living tension. It suggests that the cosmos is not a closed book. It is a pressured negotiation between order and intrusion. A predator, in this tension, would be whatever pushes the system toward irreversible erasure, the thing that makes negotiation fail. That is why the archive is so attentive to thresholds and substitutions. If harm can be diverted, it can be survived. If harm cannot be diverted, it becomes total. When the lists preserve the vocabulary of harm, they also preserve the fact that harm was expected to come in many guises. The fear is not of one creature, it is of a corridor that opens unpredictably, carrying something that eats sound. The investigation cannot claim more than the record allows. It cannot point to a single Sumerian tablet and say it reveals a cosmic predator that forced gods to hide. But it can notice something just as unsettling, that the entire scribal tradition behaves like a civilization living beside a recurring, nameless pressure, one that demanded classification, ritual infrastructure, sealed deposits, and careful language. And if that pressure had a place where it became most vivid, it might not be in lists at all. It might be in the moments when lists fail, when the world breaks so hard that only lament remains, and the words abandon classification for grief. The next corridor turns back toward those laments, not as poetry alone, but as an archive of how erasure sounded to people who believed the gods could leave a city, taking protection with them, and leaving only a hush where the streets used to speak. The Sumerian city laments do not read like distant mythology. They read like aftermath. They are filled with the texture of emptied places, courtyards where footsteps no longer cross, temples where offerings no longer smoke, streets where the familiar daily noise has been replaced by a thin wind moving through debris. Modern scholarship generally connects the major laments to historical ruptures, especially the collapse of Ur and the upheavals at the end of the third dynasty of Ur around the turn of the second millennium BCE. That grounding is persuasive, and it matters because it anchors the poetry in lived catastrophe rather than in abstract imagination. But laments are not merely reports. They are a way of naming erasure without fully explaining it. They describe devastation as if it were both political and cosmic. Armies arrive, yes, but so do storms of divine decision. The city does not simply fall, it is abandoned by its protective gods. The temple is not only looted, it becomes a sealed space without presence. The disaster is depicted as something that sweeps through like a living force, leaving the place unrecognizable even to those who once belonged there. This is where the motif of the predator becomes tempting and where restraint becomes necessary. The laments often personify the destructive force as a storm. The storm is described with agency. It roars. It covers the land. It tears away people like birds in a net. The metaphors can feel predatory because they are built from predatory logic: approach, seize, scatter, silence. Yet the laments also insist that the destruction is permitted, even decreed. Divine assemblies decide. The great gods authorize the storm. This framing is not a secret message about an outside hunter. It is theology and politics intertwined. In a world where cities are sacred bodies, their fall must be explained in sacred terms. The gods must be involved, or the meaning collapses. Still, a theology can carry fear that it cannot confess directly. The laments often contain a quiet dissonance. The gods decree destruction, but they also mourn. Divine figures wail for their cities. They plead and then withdraw. The result is not tidy justice. It is grief inside authority, as if even the decreers are unsettled by what their decrees unleash. In that dissonance, the investigation hears an older vibration, the sense that catastrophe can exceed intention. A storm sent as punishment becomes too large. A war meant to discipline becomes annihilation. A famine meant to correct becomes emptiness. The laments are full of that overshoot. They portray a system that can break past its own ability to manage consequences. That is the same posture seen in the flood traditions, and it is the same posture implied by the omen rituals. A cosmos that is governed, but not perfectly predictable. A cosmos where harm can be signaled, negotiated, diverted, and yet sometimes still arrive as total erasure. The laments also bring back the motif of sealed spaces in a literal way. Temples are described as abandoned, their doors closed, their rites halted. This is not simply a building being locked, it is a corridor being cut. In Mesopotamian life, the temple is not a private chapel, it is an economic and social engine, a storehouse, a court, a workplace, a symbolic center. When the temple becomes silent, the city's heart becomes inaccessible. In a lament, this is expressed as divine departure. In administrative terms, it is collapse. Either way, the effect is the same, the corridors that once carried life close. This closing is not only external. The laments describe people displaced, scattered, taken away. Families break, names vanish, the social archive collapses. When those people are gone, the city is not merely damaged, its memory is interrupted. Later generations may rebuild on the mound, but the continuity is broken. The record of daily life thins. Here, the title's obsession with a gap becomes sharper. Erasure in Mesopotamia is not rare. It is a repeated trauma that produces repeated discontinuities. When a city is destroyed and its population displaced, the clay archive of that city can be burned, smashed, or carried away. The tablets that survive might do so because they were baked by fire during destruction, turning fragile clay into durable ceramic. Survival, in that sense, is not always a sign of peace. Sometimes it is a sign of catastrophe. This produces an uneasy irony. The very events that silence a city can also preserve parts of its archive. A predator, if framed as an erasing force, may also leave behind hardened evidence of its passage, tablets fired by the heat of ruin. The archive becomes a fossil bed made by trauma. In the laments, the storm is sometimes described as if it has a route. It moves from one district to another. It strikes temples and walls. It pushes people toward the edges. The city becomes a map of forced movement. That map is not drawn with ink. It is drawn with fear. This is where the motif of maps that change belongs most naturally. A city's geography can be stable for centuries and then be rewritten in days by conquest or flood. The streets still exist, but their meaning shifts. A gate becomes an exit for refugees. A palace becomes a ruin. A temple courtyard becomes a shelter for the displaced, or a place too dangerous to enter. The record, too, behaves like a changing map. A tablet found in one city may preserve a tradition that originated elsewhere. A composition lamenting Ur may be copied in later centuries by scribes who never saw Ur's golden days. The text becomes a portable ruin. It carries grief across time. It also carries a warning. What happened here can happen anywhere. This portability matters because it reveals how Mesopotamian culture processed threat. It did not only process it with rituals and omens, it processed it with memorialized catastrophe. The laments are not only songs of sorrow, they are training. They teach what erasure feels like. They teach what silence sounds like. They teach that divine protection can withdraw, and that when it does, the city is exposed. Such teaching can be read politically, a way to reinforce piety, to encourage loyalty, to warn rulers against hubris. It can also be read psychologically, a way to metabolize trauma by placing it inside a framework of meaning. Both are plausible, and neither requires a cosmic predator. But the investigation is not satisfied by plausibility alone. It is looking for the particular kind of absence that feels like it shouldn't exist. In a lament, one can sometimes sense the edge of that absence, a moment where the language becomes repetitive, as if circling something it cannot face directly. The storm comes. The storm comes. The storm comes again. The city is covered. The city is covered. The city is covered again. The repetition becomes a wall of sound meant to hold back what lies behind it. If there was a fear that exceeded ordinary political disaster, if there was an anxiety about an external pressure that could strip away not only a city but the coherence of the world, then laments are where it would echo most cleanly, because laments are written from the place where coherence has already failed. And in those echoes, another question rises. How did later generations try to prevent such failures from happening again? The first millennium's apotropaic infrastructure is one answer. The omen system is another. But there is also a third, the rewriting of cosmic history itself, the reordering of divine hierarchy, the insistence that the world has a stable architecture anchored by a victorious authority. That insistence is most visible in the great creation and combat narratives, where chaos is defeated and the cosmos is built from the conquered body. Those narratives do not remove fear, they rearrange it. They relocate the predator from an unknown outside into a defeated inside, turned into structure. The next quarter leads back into that reordering, into the texts where the cosmos is described as built from a slain threat and where the victory is meant to reassure, even as it quietly admits that the threat had to exist first. Creation, in Mesopotamian thought, is often not a gentle unfolding. It is the stabilization of a hazard. The imagery that survives from the great cosmic narratives carries this openly. The world is made by confronting a threat, naming it, and then turning it into architecture. Modern readers may prefer creation myths that begin with calm water and the slow appearance of land. Mesopotamia offers something rougher. It offers order built on the edge of violence. The Babylonian creation epic, commonly called Enuma Elish, is one of the most influential examples, preserved on first millennium tablets and woven into later ritual and political life. Scholars have emphasized its connection to Babylonian theology and to the elevation of Marduk as supreme authority, especially in contexts where imperial power required cosmic justification. The epic's dramatic battle is not only a story, it is a claim about who has the right to rule. Within that claim, however, lies a disturbing admission. The cosmos contains a primordial menace, and that menace is not a minor disturbance. It is large enough to be described as a mother of monsters, a source of chaos, a force that threatens the very possibility of organized life. In the epic's logic, the victory over that menace is necessary for the existence of a stable world. Many scholars interpret this as mythic personification of chaos and natural threat, shaped by political needs. The threatening figure, Tiamat, is often understood as embodying the dangerous, unbounded aspect of the primeval waters, contrasted with the ordered world established by the victorious god. The battle is a metaphor for the creation of structure, dividing waters, setting boundaries, establishing celestial order. This interpretation does not require an external predator. The predator is chaos itself, but the metaphor structure is revealing for an investigation concerned with predation and hiding. The epic frames the primordial threat as something that cannot simply be ignored. It must be confronted, cut apart, and repurposed. The slain body becomes the sky, the earth, the architecture of the world. The threat is not banished beyond the horizon. It is incorporated. The world becomes a monument to the danger it survived. This is not comfort, it is management. In such a worldview, hiding would not necessarily mean fleeing. It could mean embedding the threat inside structure so that it is no longer free to roam. It could mean sealing chaos into the very walls of reality. The predator becomes a foundation deposit of cosmic scale, the dangerous thing placed where it can no longer move, turned into a supporting beam. That idea resonates with the physical practice of burying protective objects beneath floors. The logic is the same, only expanded. Something powerful and potentially harmful is controlled by placement and by ritual framing. The difference is that in the epic, the placement is creation itself. This logic appears elsewhere in Mesopotamian mythic material. Certain narratives describe the capture or binding of disruptive beings. Other traditions describe gates and locks at cosmic boundaries, structures that keep waters contained, that keep the underworld separate, that keep the sky ordered. The world is imagined not as open wilderness, but as a series of compartments held together by decree and barrier. Compartments imply corridors. If the cosmos is a system of compartments, then danger becomes a matter of leaks. An eclipse can be seen as a leak. A plague can be seen as a leak. A nightmare intrusion can be seen as a leak. The ritual life of Mesopotamia often reads like maintenance work, sealing leaks, patching boundaries, reasserting jurisdiction. In that maintenance mindset, the creation epic is not simply a story about beginnings. It is a charter for maintenance. It says, there was a threat. It was defeated. The defeat created the order. Therefore, order is not natural. It is enforced. Therefore, enforcement must continue. This is where the title's imagined cosmic predator can be approached without violating the record. The predator, in the most defensible reading, is not a named alien hunter. It is the category of chaos and intrusion that must be defeated, sealed, and managed. Mesopotamian texts repeatedly insist that such a category is real. They differ in how they personify it, and they disagree about its precise shape, but the insistence remains. What about the Anunnaki? Within Enuma Elish and related traditions, divine assemblies play roles in decreeing fates and assigning functions. The Anunnaki appear in some contexts as part of this divine society. They can be involved in constructing and maintaining cosmic order, sometimes placed in the underworld or associated with judgment. The details shift across texts and periods, and scholars caution against treating any one portrayal as definitive, but one theme remains stable. The gods are not solitary. They are institutions. They convene, they vote, they decree, they enforce. An institution's most immediate reaction to threat is not always heroism. It is sometimes relocation. In political history, when a city becomes vulnerable, elites retreat behind stronger walls or move to more defensible terrain. In mythic language, relocation can be expressed as a god withdrawing from a temple or as a divine assembly shifting its seat. In ritual language, relocation can be expressed as moving a dangerous omen onto a substitute. These are all forms of strategic displacement. If hiding exists in the record, it exists most clearly as displacement, moving risk away from the core. This makes the title's image of gods hiding on Earth feel less like a literal bunker and more like a mythic rendering of a structural truth. The divine is repeatedly imagined as tied to place, vulnerable to cosmic disturbance, and engaged in strategies that resemble risk management. The Anunnaki, as a collective concept, can be seen as part of that management apparatus. But the record also insists on something else. The threat does not go away. It changes form. It returns as omens, as storms, as intrusions. In the creation epic, the threat is defeated, but the universe still requires continual maintenance. If the threat were truly gone, the omen series would be unnecessary. The exorcistic corpora would be unnecessary. The apotropaic guardians would be unnecessary. Yet they exist, in abundance. This abundance can be read as evidence of cultural anxiety. It can also be read as evidence that the cosmos, as imagined, remains porous. Defeat does not equal eradication. It equals containment. Containment must be renewed. In that sense, Predator becomes a useful word only if it is understood as a metaphor for recurrence. A predator is not a one-time event. A predator returns, hunts again, adapts. The Mesopotamian archive treats danger as recurring and adaptive. A ritual works, and then must be repeated. An omen is averted, and then another omen appears. A city survives a flood, and then another flood comes. The corridors never stay sealed forever. The most unsettling possibility is not that a predator exists as a single being, but that the world itself is built from a defeated threat and therefore always carries the potential for that threat to reawaken. The storm can return because the storm is part of the architecture. The sea can rise because the sea is contained, not removed. The underworld can leak because it is gated, not annihilated. The sky can darken because darkness is a behavior in the system, not an outsider. This is a philosophy of fragile order. It explains why a civilization would become obsessed with signs, thresholds, sealed spaces, and restricted knowledge. It also explains why their myths would contain both victory and fear. And yet, the title's premise still presses a tablet that reveals something that forced hiding. If such a reveal exists within the bounds of the historical record, it may not be a myth at all. It may be a later scholarly text, an explanatory note, a ritual rubric, a commentary that treats a celestial anomaly as not merely a sign, but as an agent with intent, an attacker that must be diverted. The next corridor returns to the sky again, not in the broad language of epic, but in the cold specificity of omen interpretation. Because if the cosmos was imagined as a managed system with leaks, then the omen tablets are the maintenance logs, and sometimes logs preserve details that myths smooth over. A maintenance log is not written to comfort anyone. It is written so that the next crisis can be recognized before it arrives. In Mesopotamia, the omen tradition served something like that purpose, though wrapped in theology rather than engineering. The scribe records the sky's anomalies, links them to consequences, and hands the result to a world where the king's survival and the city's stability are not private matters. The omen tablet becomes a tool of anticipation. Within this tradition, eclipses hold a special gravity. An eclipse is visible, undeniable, and yet difficult to control. It arrives according to cycles that ancient observers could partially track, but not with modern precision. It turns day into a strange twilight or dims the moon until it looks wounded. The omen texts treat this as a moment when the boundary between order and intrusion becomes thin. The language used in the omen corpus often frames eclipses and other celestial disruptions as acts. The moon is seized, darkness covers it, a god takes the light. Even if these verbs are conventional, they create a sense of assault. The event is not neutral, it is aimed. When such an event is interpreted as dangerous for a king, the ritual response can be extreme. Protective ceremonies may be performed. A substitute may be installed. The point is not to stop the eclipse. No one imagines that as possible, but to stop the eclipse's meaning from striking its intended target. The event is treated like a projectile, unstoppable in motion, but potentially deflectable in consequence. This is where the predator analogy becomes most vivid without needing fantasy. Predation is not only about teeth, it is about targeting. The omen system presumes targeting. It presumes that harm can be addressed to a person, and that the address can sometimes be rewritten. Some scholars interpret the substitute king practice primarily as political theater, a dramatic ritual that reinforces the authority of the court's scholarly class and provides a structured response to anxiety. That interpretation is plausible. But even if it is theater built on a consistent logic of directed harm. A theater that repeats for centuries usually speaks to a durable fear. The fear is made sharper by the fact that the omen system is not purely fatalistic. It includes the possibility of evasion. That possibility implies that the incoming harm is not a simple decree carved into the universe. It behaves like a force that can be redirected. In modern terms, it resembles an agent operating under constraints. And agents invite questions. If a Mesopotamian scholar sees an eclipse and believes it signals an attack on the king, what does he imagine the attacker to be? The answer is rarely a single being. It might be a god. It might be a demon operating under divine authority. It might be the manifestation of a cosmic law. It might be the anger of a particular deity. Different texts and traditions offer different frames. The record does not hand over a unified attacker profile. But the system's own breadth suggests something else. The attacker is less important than the fact of attack. The Omen series is not trying to satisfy curiosity. It is trying to keep the world from breaking. This returns the investigation to the archive's gaps. A system so obsessed with preventing breakage should, in theory, preserve detailed descriptions of the greatest threats. Yet what survives is mostly procedural: signs, consequences, remedies. The why is often thin. The what exactly is coming is often unnamed. The language stays at the level of function rather than identity. That restraint could be genre. It could be deliberate. It could be practical. It could be because the system evolved from observation of effects rather than from confident knowledge of causes. All are plausible. Still, certain omen entries and related scholarly texts sometimes speak of unusual phenomena in ways that suggest more than weather. The problem is that unusual in ancient terms can be many things: comets, meteors, planetary conjunctions, atmospheric optics, volcanic haze, dust storms. The tablets do not always allow modern identification. Terms like torch or star can refer to different kinds of lights. Damage can obscure context. Translators can disagree. A cautious investigation must avoid turning every torch into a spacecraft. Yet, even under caution, the pattern remains. The omen tradition is a record of a civilization watching the sky for incoming irregularities and treating those irregularities as potentially lethal. This is not a minor cultural quirk. It is a major investment of attention and expertise. It implies that the sky was experienced as a place where the world could be altered abruptly. Abrupt alteration is the defining feature of predation. The next step is to connect this skywatching to the idea of hiding. If a hazard is addressed to a king, and if that hazard can be diverted onto a substitute, then the king is, for a time, hidden behind another body. Not physically hidden, perhaps, but symbolically displaced. The king continues to exist, but the danger is made to strike elsewhere. This is a form of hiding built into ritual logic. The same logic can scale up. If a city fears a celestial sign, it may perform rituals to avert harm, to cleanse, to reassert boundaries. The city is not merely praying. It is attempting to reposition itself relative to a cosmic threat. The city becomes a target trying to change its coordinates. Maps that change. In this frame, Earth becomes the map itself. The gods are not hiding on Earth because Earth is a refuge from space. They are on Earth because Earth is where the coordinates of fate are managed, where offerings, rituals, and substitutions can be performed. If danger comes from above, the response must be enacted below. The response requires ground, temple, sealed room, controlled corridor. This interpretation remains within the record. It does not require that the Anunnaki were visitors from elsewhere. It requires only that the Mesopotamian worldview treated the cosmos as a field of incoming threats and treated ritual and institutional control as the means of survival. But the title's insistence on a cosmic predator suggests something more specific: a pressure that forces gods into concealment. If that pressure exists in any historically grounded way, it might be found in the moments when even divine figures in myths behave as if they are exposed, as if the cosmos contains something that cannot be fought openly. The flood texts provide one such moment. The laments provide another. There's also a third, quieter moment in the Gilgamesh tradition: the journey beyond the edge of the known world, where the hero moves through darkness for 12 double hours, through a corridor without light, toward a place where ordinary geography fails. The geography of that passage is not described as underworld in the simple sense. It is a tunnel through the mountain, guarded by scorpion beings, leading to a garden of the gods. It is a narrative of restricted passage. It is also a narrative of fear, a place where the sun itself travels at night, unseen by humans, A corridor traveled by the sun at night implies the existence of hidden routes in the cosmos, routes that are real but not visible. If hidden routes exist, then threats can use them too. That possibility is the hinge. If the cosmos has unseen corridors, and if anomalies are signs of intrusion through those corridors, then a predator is not a creature on a stage. It is whatever moves through those corridors and makes the sky behave as if it has been touched. The record, as always, refuses to say it plainly. It gives a tunnel. It gives guardians. It gives darkness measured in hours. It gives the sense that even the sun moves through sealed space. The next corridor follows that tunnel, because sometimes myth preserves the geometry of fear more faithfully than it preserves its names. The tunnel in the Gilgamesh tradition is one of the most quietly unsettling places in ancient literature because it treats darkness as measured and architectural. Gilgamesh does not simply wander into night. He enters a passage through the mountain, guarded by scorpion beings whose gaze is described as lethal, whose presence marks a threshold that ordinary humans do not cross. He moves through a darkness that is counted in units of time, as if the tunnel is not only space but schedule. The sun itself, in this worldview, uses a hidden rote. Daylight is not an endless gift, it is a managed phenomenon that disappears into sealed corridors and returns. Scholars debate the origins and meanings of this passage. It can be read as a poetic representation of the sun's nightly journey, framed in mythic geography. It can be read as a symbolic descent into death and a search for immortality. It can be read as a narrative device that marks Gilgamesh's movement beyond the human world into divine territory. The text survives in multiple forms, and the details shift across versions and fragments. The safest statement is that the tunnel is an image of restricted access, a place where normal rules of travel and vision do not apply. Restricted access is the thread this investigation has been following. The tunnel also provides a rare thing, a cosmological diagram expressed as story. It suggests that the world has hidden infrastructure. There are gates, there are guardians, there are timed corridors, there's a garden beyond, where divine trees shine with stones and the air feels unlike ordinary air. The myth does not explain how this infrastructure was built. It simply assumes its existence. An assumed infrastructure is more telling than an explained one. It implies that the audience already accepted a cosmos with compartments and routes. The tunnel is not introduced as a new idea, it is presented as part of how things are. If the cosmos has hidden roots, then the recurring motifs, eclipses, sudden storms, intrusive winds, unaccountable sickness, can be imagined as disruptions of those routes, leaks, collisions, or incursions. The archive does not say this explicitly, but it trains the imagination toward it. It makes the world feel like a house with back hallways that most people never see. A predator in such a house does not need to break down the front door. It can use the back hallways. This does not turn Gilgamesh into a report of cosmic predation. It turns it into an index of how Mesopotamians imagine the boundaries of visibility. The sun travels unseen. The gods have spaces humans cannot enter. Guardians enforce thresholds. Darkness is not absence. It is a corridor. In that geometry, hiding is not exceptional. It is built in. The title's phrase, forced to hide, becomes, in this frame, a question about what could force activity into the hidden routes rather than the open ones. In mythic terms, that could be taboo, divine law, or the danger of crossing certain boundaries. In political terms, it could be secrecy and restricted knowledge. In psychological terms, it could be the mind's need to place fear into spaces that cannot be inspected. The archive supports all of these possibilities more readily than it supports a literal predator. But the investigation is drawn to the way the tunnel passage treats the guardians. The scorpion beings are not simply decorative monsters. They are threshold enforcers. Their gaze is described as deadly, and their role is to decide who may pass. They behave less like random beasts and more like a security apparatus. A security apparatus implies a threat that must be controlled. The guardian figures in Assyrian palaces do similar work at a different scale. Lamassu figures stand at gateways, projecting authority and warning intrusion away. Apotropaic figurines are buried in walls. Exorcistic incantations command unseen intruders out of rooms. The Gilgamesh tunnel is a mythic expression of the same logic. There are places that must not be entered without permission, because entry itself is dangerous. When such patterns repeat across genres, myth, ritual, architecture, omen, one begins to suspect that they reflect not a single historical event, but a persistent human experience of vulnerability. The world feels permeable. The borders require guardians. The guardians must be terrifying enough to do their job. Terrifying guardians can also be read as masks. A mask is a way of presenting an acceptable face to what lies outside. If the world beyond the gate contains forces that cannot be negotiated with politely, then the gatekeeper must speak their language. Fear meets fear. In this sense, the predator is not only outside, it shapes the inside. It forces the inside to become more like it. That is a quiet, incredible way to understand why Mesopotamian protective imagery can look monstrous. It is not that the culture loved horror for its own sake. It is that the culture framed protection as intimidation of the unseen. The tunnel passage also contains an element of timekeeping that feels like more than poetry. 12 double hours is not a casual phrase. It suggests a structured cosmology tied to the division of day and night. The darkness is not chaotic, it is measured. This measurement implies that even the hidden corridors are governed. They are not wilderness. They are scheduled routes in a managed system. A managed system is vulnerable to disruption. The most alarming disruptions are those that break the schedule. An eclipse that arrives, a storm that covers the sky at the wrong time, a wind that carries sickness into a city, a flood that erases boundaries. Each disruption can be seen as a moment when the hidden infrastructure fails to protect the visible world. If one wanted to speak of a cosmic predator, in the language of the record, one might speak not of a beast, but of a force that breaks schedules, crosses guarded thresholds, and turns measured corridors into open wounds. The record would still resist naming it, because the record prefers procedure to description. But the geometry is there. The investigation now circles back toward the most literal kind of hidden corridor in Mesopotamia, the temple's inner rooms, the sealed sanctuaries where only certain officials could enter, where the god's image might be washed, dressed, fed, and kept. These rooms were not public. They were restricted, guarded, and framed as potent. In some sense, they were places where divine presence was housed. If a god is housed, then a god is localized. If a god is localized, then a god can be defended. If a god can be defended, then a god can also be threatened. This is the pivot the title leans on. The idea that divine beings might need refuge. The record does not speak of gods as helpless, but it does speak of gods withdrawing, relocating, being carried away, and returning. It speaks of divine images being taken in war. It speaks of temples being abandoned. It speaks of protection failing. The most tangible evidence for divine vulnerability is historical rather than mythic, the movement of cult statues. In Mesopotamian warfare and diplomacy, the capture or return of a god statue could be treated as a major event. Royal inscriptions and letters sometimes speak of such acts as if they were cosmic shifts. The god's presence is tied to the statue in its home temple. To remove the statue is to wound the city's order. Here, hiding becomes almost literal. A cult image could be moved for protection, hidden or relocated in times of danger, though the details vary by context and are not always explicit. Even when not hidden, the mere fact that divine presence is imagined as portable and capturable suggests that the sacred is not invulnerable. It can be displaced. Displacement is the language of survival in this archive. Flood stories displace fate onto a boat. Omen rituals displace danger onto a substitute. Apotropaic deposits displace protection into hidden corners. Myths displace the sun through tunnels at night. History displaces gods through statues moved by war. If a predator exists, it would be the force that makes displacement necessary. The next quarter, then, is not into deeper myth, but into the historical record of divine images moving under pressure, because in that movement, one can see how ancient people themselves understood threat. not as a philosophical problem, but as something that could seize even the gods' houses and force their presence into new guarded spaces. In Mesopotamian history, a god could be taken, not metaphorically, not as a mere insult. The physical image of a deity, its cult statue, could be removed from its temple during war, carried away as spoil, and held elsewhere. The surviving sources that speak of this are varied: royal inscriptions, chronicles, letters, later recollections. Each must be read with care, because kings use such narratives to frame their legitimacy. A ruler who returned a stolen god could present himself as a restorer of cosmic order. A ruler who captured a god could present himself as divinely favored. The political uses are obvious, but the underlying assumption is still striking. Divine presence is tied to place and to a physical focus, and therefore can be displaced under pressure. A city without its god is not simply demoralized, it is exposed. This is not the same as saying that the gods themselves were frightened animals hiding on earth. It is to say that the religious system treated divine presence as something that could be moved, sheltered, and, in a sense, managed. The sacred had logistics. Logistics implies vulnerability. If a cult statue can be seized by an enemy army, then the god's house can be violated. If the god's house can be violated, then the boundary between cosmic order and human violence is thin. The line between political catastrophe and metaphysical catastrophe collapses. It is no surprise, then, that laments describe divine withdrawal, and that omens treat the sky as invested in kingship. The gods are not distant spectators, they are embedded. A well known historical example often discussed in scholarship is the movement of Marduk's statue from Babylon during periods of conflict. Sources from different eras describe times when the statue was taken and later returned, and later kings framed these events as markers of disorder and restoration. The details, motives, and exact chronology can be contested, and different textual traditions can emphasize different aspects. But the existence of the motif is reliable. The absence of the god's image is a sign of a broken world. This motif repeats across regions and periods. Elamite incursions into Mesopotamia, Assyrian campaigns, Babylonian retaliations, each could involve the movement of cult images. Sometimes this was framed as punitive. Sometimes it was framed as protective relocation. The sources are not always explicit about hiding, but relocation under threat is a form of concealment in practice. A precious object is moved away from a front line, into a safer corridor, into a more defensible space. Even a god's image can be treated that way. Here, the title's central contradiction becomes more complex. A modern imagination pictures the Anunnaki hiding on Earth from a cosmic predator. The historical record instead shows humans moving God's images on Earth in response to human threats: war, conquest, political collapse. The hiding is not cosmic, it is logistical. But the emotional structure is similar. There is a sense that something powerful is being pursued, that it must be protected, that it must be taken through restricted corridors to safety. And the record adds another layer. When a god is displaced, the world becomes dangerous in new ways. A city's rituals may halt. Its protective order may be believed to weaken. Its political structure may fracture. People may interpret subsequent disasters, famine, plague, defeat, as consequences of divine absence. In this way, displacement itself can become a generator of further fear, feeding back into the system. A predator does not need to be a beast, it can be a chain reaction. The more the archive is examined, the more it reveals that Mesopotamian fear was often systemic. Disaster triggers ritual. Ritual triggers political action. Political action triggers further disruption. The texts are filled with attempts to stabilize feedback loops, omens to predict, rituals to avert, hymns to reassure, epics to justify order. The entire cultural machine can be seen as a response to the fragility of a world where a river can erase a harvest and an army can erase a city's god. If one wanted to locate the title's cosmic predator within this framework, one could propose that the predator is whatever exploits fragility, whatever turns localized harm into total erasure. In myth, that might be chaos personified. In omen logic, it might be an incoming blow addressed to the king. In lament, it might be the storm that covers the land. In history, it might be the political machine of conquest. All are predators of a sort, and all leave silence. But the title asks for something that forced the Anunnaki to hide. In the historical record, the gods are not shown building bunkers. They are shown being carried, moved, housed, and sometimes stolen. The beings doing the hiding are humans, acting to preserve the continuity of divine presence in a world where corridors can be breached. This is where a responsible narrative investigation can sharpen into its central question. Perhaps the predator is not a creature in the sky, but a recurring pattern that acts like a predator: invasion, capture, displacement, silence. Perhaps the gods' hiding is a mythic way of talking about a society forced to move its sacred centers repeatedly under pressure. The Anunnaki, as a divine collective, become the symbolic face of that sacred center. Yet the archive still holds another tension. The fear is not limited to human enemies. The omen texts insist on danger coming from the sky. The flood texts insist on catastrophe arriving from the waters. The exorcistic texts insist on intrusion arriving at night. Even if each can be explained in human and environmental terms, the persistence of multi-directional threats suggests a worldview where danger is not confined to one domain. The world is a field of approach vectors. A field of approach vectors is exactly how a hunted thing experiences space. So the narrative returns once more to the notion of forced. What forces a civilization into a life of sealed spaces and restricted corridors? Often it is not one enemy. It is repeated exposure to different kinds of erasure. The response becomes a way of living. Building walls, burying protections, reading the sky, maintaining the temple's inner rooms, keeping certain knowledge inside certain hands. And in that way of living, the record leaves behind artifacts that resemble the title's promise, not because they name a cosmic predator, but because they show a culture behaving as if something beyond ordinary control can strike, seize, and remove what is most central. There's a final corridor that has been avoided so far because it is too easy to misuse: the boundary between academic translation and popular retelling. Modern narratives often cite a Sumerian tablet as proof of modern claims, but the chain from tablet to claim is rarely shown. The gap often lies not in the clay, but in the story told about the clay. To approach that gap, the investigation must turn toward the material reality of tablets, how they are broken, joined, translated, and circulated. It must look at how a single damaged line can be expanded into certainty by an eager reader, and how that certainty can then be repeated until it sounds ancient. The next corridor, then, is not into deeper myth or deeper history, but into the modern handling of the ancient record. Museum drawers, fragments, joins, translations, and the quiet places where uncertainty is supposed to be preserved, but where it sometimes gets overwritten by the hunger for revelation. A clay tablet is small enough to be misunderstood. It can fit into a hand, and yet it can contain a world. It can also contain a mistake, a sign misread, a broken wedge assumed to be a different sign, a gap filled too confidently. In cuneiform studies, the distance between what the clay actually says and what a modern reader believes it says is bridged by painstaking habits: photographs, hand copies, collations, join work, parallel manuscripts, and the slow discipline of admitting when a line is uncertain. Meaning turns. A tablet's edge breaks off meaning turns. A tablet's edge breaks off mid-verb. A line ends with half a sign. A name is missing its determinative. Sometimes the damage is so extensive that the most one can say is that a ritual or a myth was once here. In museums, the fragments live in drawers and boxes. Some are cataloged with care. Some are still waiting for modern photography or updated readings. Fragments can be joined after a century of separation when a scholar recognizes the fit of a broken edge or the continuity of a phrase. A join can change a translation. A new parallel manuscript can change a whole passage's tone. This means that certainty in this field is always provisional. The title's premise, a Sumerian tablet reveals, leans on the modern hunger for the decisive artifact. But the discipline of Assyriology is built around the opposite, the recognition that revelation is usually a mirage created by overconfidence. The clay rarely offers a clean confession. It offers a sentence with missing words and a footnote of doubt. This is where modern retellings often become most dangerous, not because they are malicious, but because they compress uncertainty into spectacle. A cautious translation becomes a definitive quote. A debated reading becomes a narrative fact. A fragment whose provenance is poorly documented becomes a secret tablet. A scholar's tentative reconstruction becomes the spine of a cosmic drama. The record does not need conspiracies to produce this. It only needs repetition. A claim is made in a book or an article aimed at popular audiences. It is repeated by another writer. It becomes a line in a documentary script. It is quoted in a forum. After enough repetition, the claim feels older than it is. It begins to sound like it came directly from a museum shelf, when it actually came from a chain of retelling that quietly dropped the original caveats. A cosmic predator is the kind of phrase that thrives in such chains. It is vivid. It is easy to remember. It fits the shape of fear. It attaches to the real motifs in Mesopotamian texts: devouring, darkness, seizure, intrusion, and then hardens into a new story that the clay never quite states. A responsible investigation cannot erase the popular story, because the popular story exists and has cultural weight, but it can place it beside the actual mechanics of the record and ask, gently, where the story might have found its raw material. Often the raw material is not a single line about a predator. It is a cluster of images that can be assembled into that shape if one is willing to ignore genre and context. Take the sky. Devouring the moon during an eclipse. In omen language, this can be framed as seizure. In a modern retelling, seizure can become predation. Add the idea that the gods fear the flood, that they cower, that they regret. Add the creation epic's battle with chaos. Add the exorcistic text's language of intruders that sit on the chest at night. Add the lament storm that covers the city and leaves silence. The assemble pattern begins to look like a single enemy moving across levels of reality, forcing even gods into defensive postures. But the assembly is modern. The ancient sources remain multiple and partial. They do not confirm a single predator story. They confirm a worldview in which predation is a useful metaphor for harm, and in which harm can arrive from many directions. If there is a gap that shouldn't exist, it may not be the absence of a predator narrative. It may be the absence of clarity about why Mesopotamian texts are so focused on boundary maintenance, why thresholds, omens, and exorcisms occupy so much intellectual space. One can answer that with ordinary history, precarious life, environmental volatility, political instability, disease, and the psychological need for control. Those are sufficient. And yet, sufficiency does not always satisfy. A system that builds such elaborate defenses can feel, from the outside, like a system responding to a pressure that it cannot fully describe. The pressure may be the world itself, repeatedly proving that it can erase a city without asking permission. Or it may be a deeper fear of cosmic indifference, translated into gods and demons so it can be spoken aloud. In that sense, the modern phrase cosmic predator is not a discovery but a symptom. It is what a later imagination calls the same old feeling, that something beyond the walls is hungry. The tablets do not correct this feeling, they refine it. They show what it looked like when translated into administration and ritual. They show how fear became a profession: the omen reader, the exorcist, the temple steward, the scribe who copies the correct word so that the correct protection can be performed. They show how fear became architecture: the guardian at the gate, the deposit under the floor, the sealed inner room where the god's image is kept and tended, hidden from ordinary eyes. And they show how fear became controlled language. A tablet does not say predator in modern terms. It says seizure, covering, devouring, evil wind, unknown evil, storm, decree. Each word is a handle on something felt. Each handle is also a limit. When a phenomenon is too vast to be held, Language builds a smaller grip and pretends it is enough. This is why the modern handling of the ancient record matters so much. The clay asks to be treated with restraint because it is already fragile. The missing wedges are not empty space waiting for invention. They are the boundary between what can be said and what must remain uncertain. In the quiet rooms of scholarship, uncertainty is preserved on purpose. A translation includes brackets. A reconstruction is marked as such. A doubt's noted. The tone is careful, sometimes painfully so. That care can feel unsatisfying to an audience hungry for a single answer. But the care is what prevents the past from being overwritten by the present's desires. And yet the desire itself is part of the story now. The title's promised tablet, the cosmic predator, the hiding gods. These are modern shapes cast onto ancient clay. They reveal not only what people think the ancient world contained, but what they need it to contain. A reason for vulnerability, a name for the pressure, a narrative that makes fear legible. The investigation, at this late point, does not need to dismiss that desire. It needs only to return it to the motifs the ancient record actually supports. Silence after catastrophe, sealed spaces, restricted corridors, maps that shift under pressure, anomalies in the sky that demand response, and a cosmos imagined as managed because unmanaged cosmos would be unbearable. If the predator is allowed to remain metaphorical, the archive becomes clearer. The predator is erasure itself, the recurring capacity of the world to remove cities, names, and continuity. It is the storm that can arrive from the horizon and turn a living place into a quiet mound. It is the eclipse that reminds a king that power does not control the sky. It is the disease that enters a house without knocking. It is the war that carries away a god's image and leaves a temple hollow. And the Anunnaki, in this reading, are not refugees from space. They are the faces of an order that tries to remain intact inside that erasure. Their hiding is the system's hiding, the ritual placed under the floor, the knowledge kept inside a narrow lineage, the divine presence housed in a sealed room, protected by guardians that stare into the unseen. One corridor remains. It is not a corridor toward proof. It is a corridor toward meaning. It asks what it does to a civilization, and to anyone listening now, when the world is experienced as a place where order is always provisional, and where the most honest thing the archive can offer is not an answer, but a sustained practice of living beside the edge of disappearance. The edge of disappearance is not dramatic in the way modern stories often insist it should be. It is quiet. It is a thinning. It is a street that loses its vendors one by one, until the sound that once proved life becomes a memory that cannot be located in any surviving stone. It is a temple whose lamps go out and are not relit. It is a name on a tablet that no one will speak again because the family line is gone. It is a map that still exists, but whose meanings have been scraped away by new footprints. Mesopotamia, more than most places, teaches this because it left so much behind and still could not prevent its own erasures. The clay survived in staggering quantities, and yet it survives unevenly. Whole libraries come to us broken. Whole decades vanish into silence. A king's boast survives, but the voices of the people who carried his bricks do not. A ritual formula survives, but the specific fear that once animated it is reduced to a word in a list. That reduction is not failure. It is what time does. In the face of that, the Mesopotamian response was not, in the first place, to demand a single explanation. It was to build habits, watch the sky, mark the anomaly, speak the words that have worked before, seal the corners, place the guardian at the gate, keep the god's house tended, move the sacred image if the corridor ahead is unsafe. Accept that the world contains routes that cannot be seen, and therefore must be managed through what can be seen. Gestures, thresholds, schedules, offerings, and the careful repetition of language. If a cosmic predator must exist in this landscape, it exists as the felt fact that the world can eat what it once held. It is not a creature with a catalog name and a stable biography. It is a capacity. It is the way water can forget its banks. It is the way wind can become a wall, It is the way a knight can press down on the chest and make breath feel borrowed. It is the way a city can be present in the morning and gone by the next season's accounting. The archive offers no final confession about such a force. It offers a pattern of responses that imply it. The pattern is the evidence. The system of defense is the most honest testimony because it does not rely on a single line that can be mistranslated or sensationalized. It relies on repetition across genres and centuries. The same insistence on sealed spaces, the same fear of intrusion, the same attention to irregular signs, the same ritual logic of diversion and substitution. And within that repetition, the divine beings, whether called Anunnaki in some contexts or by other collective terms in others, appear less like distant rulers and more like the grammar of order itself. They stand for decisions, assemblies, judgments, the fixing of boundaries. They stand for the belief that the universe can be arranged, even if only temporarily, into something that does not collapse. That is why the most haunting moments in the corpus are not the battles with monsters, but the withdrawals. A god leaves a city. A temple becomes silent. The protective presence is imagined as stepping back, not because the god is weak, but because the order the god represents has been interrupted. The interruption is what feels predatory. It is what turns a living city into an abandoned mound. To modern listeners, it can be tempting to treat the predator as an external invader. That keeps the fear at a distance. It makes the world's hunger into a single face that could, at least in imagination, be confronted. But the Mesopotamian materials, taken on their own terms, suggest something less comfortingly specific. That the danger is woven into the system. Chaos is not outside the house. It is the pressure the house is built to hold back. The house can stand for centuries, and then, without warning, a corridor opens and the pressure returns. In this light, the sealed deposits under floors and the guardian figures at gates become more than ancient curiosities. They become symbols of how humans respond when they realize they are not the owners of the corridors they walk through. A threshold is both an entrance and a vulnerability. A door can keep a body out, but it cannot keep out time, drought, rumor, disease, eclipse, or the sudden collapse of agreements that once seemed permanent. So the door is reinforced with language. The language is reinforced with ritual. The ritual is reinforced with institution. The institution is reinforced with myth. And myth, in the end, is reinforced with the simple act of copying the signs again, because copying is a way of saying that the line has not been erased yet. The clay tablets themselves embody this. Each wedge pressed into wet clay is an act of refusal against disappearance. It is a deliberate scar left on matter, meant to outlast the breath that made it. And yet the tablets also show the limits of refusal. They crack, they break, they lose edges. They become fragments that someone later holds and tries to join back into a whole. A fragment invites the mind to fill what is missing. Sometimes the fill is careful. Sometimes it is hungry. The difference matters because hunger can overwrite the very silence it is trying to escape. The most respectful posture toward the ancient record is to allow the silence to remain part of the truth, to accept that some corridors are closed, and that forcing them open with certainty creates a different kind of erasure. In the end, what survives from Mesopotamia is not a final answer about what hunted whom. What survives is a portrait of a civilization that lived with the awareness that the world can remove what it once gave, and that the only workable response is to build meaning into the very act of guarding. A guardian does not need to know the predator's true name. A guardian needs to stand. And perhaps that is the most enduring image. A threshold at night, a carved gaze fixed into darkness, a sealed room behind it where presence is tended in silence. And beyond the gate, the wide, unlit corridors of the world, endlessly capable of change, endlessly capable of erasure, and yet, in the stubborn persistence of clay and memory, never fully allowed to win.